Good evening, everyone. I'm Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Jim Teske. We're back with another edition of Teske's Tidbits. I know we're getting closer to winter, but something happened at the end of October in the tropics with Hurricane Melissa. And one of our previous guests was kind of integral in terms of tracking the storm and actually going into the storm. So I thought we'd chat with him again, and we were bringing back Andy HAZELTON, Dr. Andy HAZELTON from the University of Miami. And welcome back, Andy, first off.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And I appreciate you being on here because you had a very busy end of October. And, just to kind of break it down, we'll get into the details, the nitty gritty about what you did with Melissa. But I thought it would be a good idea to maybe start. You flew into several missions for Melissa, but give people background of what the basic mission is for hurricane hunters when they go into hurricanes and tropical systems.
Yeah, basically we're trying to get as much information as we can about where the storm is, how strong it is. Obviously where, that's kind of the basic things that the National Hurricane Center is trying to forecast, the location, the path, the intensity. So we're giving that information, and then also details about the storm structure, just how big it is, how aligned the vortex is, which can give information about, how future intensity may be. And things like that. And also the data we're collecting goes to the National Hurricane Center, it goes to where the public can see it, but the data also goes directly into the computer models that are used to make forecasts. So we're providing both observations and also helping the forecasts with this data, and collecting things from dropsondes, which is some of the data I was working on for Melissa, radar, flight level, all sorts of different instruments get collected during these flights.
Now, explain the drop sounds a little bit. I've seen, footage of it. It looks, it's a package of instruments, and it looks like it goes through a pneumatic tube or whatever. And it's kind of fascinating, but that's how you get, I don't want to say a lot of data, but some of the most important data, I think, that you get from tropical systems.
Yep, and it's because what those, they drop down with a parachute. And what those allow us to do is it really allows us to collect data from below the plane, even at altitudes where it's not really safe to fly the plane, like down, kind of near the ocean surface and in the boundary layer. You can't do the P3 down there because it just, it's not safe. But you can drop these instruments, and so we drop it out of a tube. It goes out the parachute. It takes about 10 minutes to fall. It's collecting temperature, pressure, wind, all the different meteorological information as it goes down. And we do a bunch of these, usually 15 to 25 throughout a flight in different key locations like the eye wall, the eye, and then sort of along our flight path to give sort of a picture of the storm. And it sort of, along with the radar, really gives you a three-dimensional look at it.
So describe the flight path in a typical storm, because I've seen on social media some of the near real-time data. It looks like it's almost like an X shape that you fly through, and you kind of touched on it briefly. You're at a certain height. You cannot go below a certain height. Is that correct?
Yeah, typically for a well-developed system, we'll fly either at 10,000 feet or 8,000 feet. You don't want to go too high because then you get into icing issues. But too low, you don't get the boundary layer. You get too close to the surface. So usually that 8 to 10,000 feet. I think the Air Force will sometimes fly as low as 5,000 feet, especially for weaker storms. Sort of that 5 to 10,000 foot range is sort of the sweet spot where you can collect data and be safe. But yeah, the typical path is either at that alpha to X, or sometimes we call it a rotated figure 4, where we'll turn and go downwind and cross anywhere between 3 or 4 times, depending on how close we are to the storm. Really, the idea is to get as much coverage of different quadrants of the storm as we can.
Okay, so there's a method to the madness in terms of that specific path.
Right.
And obviously you mentioned the fact that people are using it in real time at the National Hurricane Center. And I know it goes into the models now. About when did that happen? I mean, that's fairly recent that they've been able to put that into modeling.
Yeah, I think HWRF, was the first model to use the radar data, and that's been going on for about 10 years now. But things like some of the dropsonde data is going into like the GFS and the Euro. That's also within the last decade. So it's really, just within the last 5 to 10 years that this has started to happen, and we started to really understand the value of this data, and studies have been done to show how that data improves the forecast, and also design flight paths to maximize data collection for that purpose.
Yeah. So, you do this with the drop sounds, and you're flying in there, and I'm sure there's some people that look at this and say, why can't you just get the data from the satellite? I mean, you see a lot from the storm with the satellite and other observations. Why is flying into the storm with hurricane hunters so important, even in this day and age?
Yeah, satellites are great. We have there's a ton of satellites that come a long way. But really, they give you just kind of a high-level view. Geostationary satellites give you either kind of a cloud-top infrared or visible look. You have microwave satellites, but those are kind of hit or miss, and they still only give you a couple levels. So really, the only way to get that full three-dimensional structure from the top to bottom, to understand like the depth of the storm and if it's aligned or tilted, and get that full three-dimensional wind field, is to go in there with Doppler radar and get it. We're working on new instruments like drones that can go down to the near the surface and get even more of that boundary layer data that's so critical. That's what's really feeding the storm. And there's just some of that real fine resolution data below the clouds you just can't get from a satellite.
Now we'll go into more detail in the second part of the interview here, but how many flights? You said you were in 5 just for Melissa, but do you have any sense of how many you've been in total to this point?
Yeah, I have to go back and count exactly. It's probably getting close to 40 to 50 total when you count all the different tropical storms and hurricanes. I'm over 100 in the metric they call eye wall penetrations. Where a penetration is like one time across the eye wall into the eye and back out. You usually get if you're in a hurricane, 3 or 4 of those per flight. So I think went over 100 last year in Helene, and so when you add on this year, probably something like 110. So probably 40 or so for actual hurricane flights at this point.
And on a typical flight, I mean, you've probably got a pilot, co-pilot. How many scientists like yourself are typically on one of those flights?
It could be anywhere from 2 or 3 to maybe 5 or 6, depending on exactly how many different experiments we're doing. For these particular flights, because of the government shutdown, we weren't able to do really able to do any additional research, so it was kind of just bare bones. But you have your 5 or 6 scientists. You have the pilots, the engineers, the crew to do different things with the instruments. The data techs, and so it's typically a crew of anywhere between 15 and 20 or so on a given flight.
Mm-hmm. Now it's kind of, I don't want to say old hat for you, but what was it like for your first flight? Did it take some adjusting to the turbulence that you get when you go in there into a hurricane?
Yeah, you never quite know how you're going to react. And thankfully, I don't get too bad with the motion sickness. Some of us do take like Dramamine and different things to help with that. But, honestly, the flights that are just the big jolt in the eye wall aren't too bad. It's really the ones that are sort of, we have a large storm and it's sort of bumping up and down a lot over time. Those are the ones that are I find harder to do.
So for people that fly commercial and have gone through a bad flight with turbulence, how would you compare that with what you go through with a hurricane?
I would say your average hurricane is probably just like a bumpy, turbulent commercial flight. Especially if it's a big hurricane, you kind of have this constant. But like Melissa, we can talk about in a minute. But that was more. There was less of that. Like the outer part was pretty calm. It was just these big sudden jolts in the eye wall, for a couple minutes and then you're done. So it's a little different, obviously more extreme.
Okay. So we got the basics out of the way. Now we're going to take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll get into the weeds here with Melissa and finish that part. And I'm interested to find out what you found interesting with this storm. So we'll be right back, and we'll talk a little bit more. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Jim Teske, and we are talking about the tropics. And for this particular interview, I have Dr. Andy HAZELTON from the University of Miami. And we were talking about hurricane hunters in general, but Andy, you were on 5 missions for Hurricane Melissa at the end of October. first off, how do you get on these flights? Is there like a rotation in terms of scientists that go on these flights? Do people volunteer? How does that work?
Yeah, so we kind of come up with a schedule before the season of who's going to go in. We don't have to follow that exactly, but it kind of gives you an idea. So I saw early on in the season, I was like, okay, I'm on for late October. I was on also early in the year, like for Hurricane Aaron. But, I was like late October, you can have stuff, but maybe not. But then, it just turned out, I could kind of see on some of the long range modeling that, the Caribbean might get active. And so I was kind of ready for it. And then Melissa formed, and originally we were only doing one set of flights. So I was actually helping with ground support for the first couple missions, but then we went to 2 planes per day starting that Saturday, as Melissa was, sort of becoming more of a threat. And so I started flying on Saturday, I guess it was October 22nd, maybe, or 23rd right then. And kind of went from there all the way through, the landfall in Jamaica, and the day after was over Cuba.
Yeah. So when you first signed up and it was the end of October, you were probably thinking, it's kind of the end of the season and may not be much going on. So in a sense, I don't know. I mean, we've seen systems be late in the season, but it was probably still a little bit of a surprise to see something that late, so that strong that late in the season.
Yeah, I think it's one of the latest and strongest Category 5s ever. I mean, we've seen Wilma and others like it, but this late, almost getting into November, it's pretty rare.
Yeah, and where do you fly out of? I know there's a number of different places where the planes fly out of. Where were you flying out of?
This one was out of Lakeland. That part of the Caribbean is a challenge to get to, really. Because sometimes we'll fly out of Puerto Rico or St. Croix or Barbados, but the Southwest Caribbean is sort of, if you run the numbers, it's sort of a long flight from just about anywhere that we fly out of. So It made most sense, just to fly out of Lakeland. It was a couple hours down to it, so it limits the amount of time you have in the storm, and makes the whole day a little bit longer, but it worked out pretty well.
So let's get into the storm. I mean, the first couple of flights that you went in, I mean, how does that compare? I mean, I think I heard you were in. You mentioned Helene from last year. I mean, what did you see this time that was different from some other storms?
Yeah, so it was. The first couple flights, the first one was almost a hurricane. Second one, it was, it had intensified quite a bit. It was a Category 4, I think. Certainly the last flight, or the next to last flight, number 4, right before landfall, when the storm was below 900 millibars, and so we got some record winds on our drop zone. That was sort of stronger than any storm I've ever been in. Never been in a Category 5 before. Our third flight was a Category 5 on that. We actually had some turbulence such that we had to go back and check the plane out just because of how rough it was. So it was probably some of the bumpiest flight that I've ever had. And certainly, like I said, on that Tuesday, stronger than any storm I've ever been in, and one of the strongest storms ever in the Atlantic.
So were you on the flight where they did the drop sound that had potentially the highest, like 251 mile per hour wind gust?
Yeah, I was actually processing the drop zone data. So they drop it out of the parachute or the tube, and then the data comes back. I quality control it and send it out. So I was sort of seeing that data coming in real time, and I basically was, I saw, I think it was 170 knots, so like 195 mile an hour surface wind, which is pretty extreme. And then I saw that value, and I've never seen anything that high. I've processed quite a few of these at this point, and my scale on my display only goes to like 100 meters per second. So this was above that. So I knew we were dealing with something very unusual, and I went through that one carefully a few times because I knew it would get quite a bit of attention on social media and elsewhere.
Okay, and that, just so people at home know, that reading of 251 mile per hour winds was not right at the surface. It was a little bit above, right?
Yeah, it was about 250 meters, so about 750 feet up. So a little bit above the surface. The problem is in Jamaica there, even right along the coast, there is some hilly terrain. So, this measurement was just a few miles offshore. So it's conceivable that some of those kind of wind gusts could have made it, onto the elevated terrain there. And unfortunately, based on some of the pictures I've seen with just, total destruction of trees and, just basically bark off of trees, it looks like, high-end tornado damage there. And so I think some of that wind did make it down to the surface there.
So what will happen with that recording? Because you mentioned quality control. I would guess there's going to be some process to verify that even more going forward.
Yeah, we've already had some conversations with different experts at NHC and elsewhere that have sort of done a first look at it, and it seems valid. But I guess there may be somebody from the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, that takes a look at it, and if there's a way to sort of officially classify it and further sort of cement that, they'll be the ones to do that.
So when you say you were double checking it, I mean, you're seeing it going off your scale and whatever, and you've got a big wind gust there. I mean, what are you doing to, like, oh my God, this could be record breaking. What are you doing to double check that?
Yeah, just going through the software, making sure that the quality control didn't miss anything, because sometimes for some reason, there will be erroneous data, like the sound will keep sending data after it splashes, or maybe the parachute breaks, and that can mess up the calculation. But we didn't see any evidence of that in this one. It was falling at the typical rate, and the data was clean, it was continuous, and there weren't big jumps. It was just a really, really, really extreme wind profile.
So that was part of what you're doing as you're measuring things in the storm. I got to guess though that the highlight of any mission is to actually fly into the eye. What is that experience like?
Yeah, well, it's pretty jarring to go from the eye wall where you're really getting rocked up and down, and you can't see anything. There's just water all over your window, and you're in the cloud, and then you come out, you're in the eye, you start to see kind of the bright, and then you come out in the middle of the eye, and you could kind of see the stadium effect with the wall all around. And every eye is different. Some are a little bit bigger, some are a little bit smaller. Even on Melissa, between Monday and Tuesday, the eye actually got a little bit bigger. The slope was a little bit more. So just seeing how that changes from storm to storm, and even within a given storm, is pretty remarkable.
And I mean, that's something that, you research a lot, correct, on the eye wall and the eye itself. One of the things that happen in very intense hurricanes is that the eye wall will replace itself. And I'm from what I read, it really didn't happen before it made landfall, which kind of makes Melissa a bit unique, correct?
Yeah, usually you'll get this process where sort of an outer eye will form, and it eventually chokes off the inner one and causes weakening, and then it'll try to sort of cycle itself, and usually in the process the storm grows, but maybe kind of comes down off its peak intensity. That never really happened with this. It was fairly compact all the way to landfall. It sort of tried a couple times, I think, but for some reason that outer eye wall just never really formed. So that's what allowed it to be such extreme intensity. Maybe the, I guess, partial saving grace for Jamaica is that, because the wind field stayed pretty compact, the eastern part of the island, like over by Kingston, didn't really get that much impact. Whereas if it had grown, maybe you would have had sort of less impact right at landfall, but a bigger impact over the whole island. So it's sort of always a trade-off with these. Do you get the single, sort of intense focus, or, kind of a broader, larger wind, but it was definitely going to be bad either way.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, as I think a lot of us saw, that the damage where it did make landfall was catastrophic, just as it was predicted to be. Going forward, though, I would imagine there's going to be a lot of research done on this storm, and partly because of what we just talked about with the eye wall, but I'm sure that there'll be a lot of things that papers will be written and things like that in the years to come.
Definitely. Why didn't it do an eye wall cycle? What was it allowed it to intensify so much? And, some of the different, for a while, there was a lot of track uncertainty. Is this going to go up toward Hispaniola? Is it going to keep going west, over toward Cuba? Jamaica was unfortunately kind of always in the middle of all of that, and that's where it ended up. But, there's going to be a lot of large scale and small scale things that we're going to look at in this case. And, it can teach us a lot for future storms. Yeah.
It'll keep you busy for a while to come.
That's for sure.
The last thing I wanted to ask you is, what can you say about the pilots that do this? I mean, it's one thing for you to be sitting there putting drop sounds down and looking at monitors and stuff like that, but they're doing the flying. What do you have to say about them?
Yeah, they're the best of the best. Megan and the crew that I flew with, they do a great job. There's a video on social media of just showing them going through it, and they're sitting there, flying through, as the plane's going like this, just cool as a cucumber, keeping it steady. And yeah, I can't say enough about the work they do. And they're the ones that make this all possible. Them and the maintenance crews. The plane we flew, we were going back to back on the same plane, and so 5-6 days of going twice a day. That the plane gets bumped around. The maintenance crews did a great job of getting that back up and ready, and we didn't miss any flights as a result. So I can't say enough about the work those people did during this and all the missions I've flown with them.
Yeah, well, we thank them for the work that they do, and also the work that you do, because for us in the trenches, on TV or at the Weather Service, I mean, the data that you provide us is invaluable. So, I mean, we know almost in real time what's going on with the storms now, and it's just fascinating to hear stuff like that. So. We thank you again for taking the time. I know you've been very busy the last couple of weeks, and I appreciate you taking a little bit of time to talk to us today about Hurricane Melissa and the hurricane hunters as well.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to chat, and hope everyone learned a little bit more about what we do today.
Thanks again, Andy.
Thank you.